There is a sacred stillness that precedes the true voice of God, a silence that many run from but few understand. Before a man can truly hear from God, something within him must die. The stubborn will, the pride of independence, the hidden confidence in one's own understanding. This inner breaking is not a punishment, but a purification. God cannot share his deepest truth with a heart still ruled by self, for self always twists divine revelation to serve its own purpose. The voice of God is not heard in the thunder of ambition or the noise of self-assurance. It is whispered in the quiet ruins of a surrendered soul, when man's strength is stripped away, when every illusion of control collapses. Then the spirit becomes tender enough to receive the eternal word. God waits patiently for this moment, not because he enjoys our suffering, but because only brokenness can birth true intimacy. The unbroken self prays loudly but never listens deeply. It serves zealously but often from the wrong source. Only through breaking can the outer shell of pride give way to the inner life of the Spirit. In every age, those who walked most closely with God were those who had first been broken. Moses in the wilderness, Elijah in the cave, Paul on the road to Damascus, all were stripped of their self-sufficiency before they could truly hear and obey. The process is painful, but it is holy. When God begins to break a man, he is not destroying him, he is freeing him from himself. It is through the cracks of that brokenness that the light of revelation enters, and through that surrender that the true voice of God can finally be heard. The greatest barrier between man and the voice of God is not sin in its outward form, but the self-will that quietly sits on the throne of the heart. A man may pray earnestly, read the scriptures faithfully, and serve in the name of God, yet if his will is still the master of his choices, he will never truly hear the Lord's voice. The self-will has a language of its own. It speaks in desires, ambitions, and fears, constantly interpreting God's silence through the lens of its own wants. The voice of God becomes faint, distorted, or entirely drowned out by the noise within. The breaking of self-will, then, is not an option for the believer seeking to hear God. It is the doorway through which revelation flows. When the self is unbroken, even spiritual activity becomes self-driven. One can quote scripture and still live out of pride, pray long prayers, yet only seek confirmation of personal agendas, or serve in ministry while hungering for recognition. God cannot entrust his voice to such a heart, for it will misuse divine truth for self-advancement. To hear God, the self must first be crucified, its desires silenced, its strength surrendered. This breaking does not happen through effort, but through surrender. God, in his mercy, allows circumstances to frustrate us, people to misunderstand us, and plans to collapse, so that the walls of self-will begin to crumble. It is in this place of weakness and defeat that we finally let go of our own way and begin to hear his. Many resist this process because breaking feels like loss. We think surrender means failure, when in reality it is freedom. The more the self-will is alive, the more we struggle against God's ways. But when it is broken, peace flows like a river. The voice of God becomes clear, not because he speaks louder, but because the noise within has finally quieted. The soul that is broken no longer argues with divine direction. It yields. It no longer questions why, but trusts even when it does not understand. God does not shout over our will. He waits until it yields. His voice is not hidden in mystery, but revealed in humility. When a man reaches the end of himself, when he no longer insists on being right, in control, or understood, then the Spirit finds space to speak. The heart that once resisted God now becomes tender, teachable, and still. In that silence, the whisper of God is unmistakable. What once felt distant becomes intimate. What once seemed confusing becomes clear. The breaking of self-will is painful, yes, but through it, the believer is transformed from a servant who strives into a vessel that listens. Only when the self-will bows does the voice of God rise in power and purity within the soul. The illusion of control is one of the most deceptive forms of bondage in the spiritual life. Many believe they are surrendered to God simply because they speak the language of faith, attend church, or perform religious duties. Yet deep within, they are still the masters of their own path. They choose obedience only when it aligns with their desires and resist anything that threatens their comfort or ambition. This quiet rebellion, clothed in the garments of piety, blinds the soul to the true nature of submission. The illusion of control convinces a person that they are walking with God, while in truth they are walking beside Him, not behind Him. Until the self is broken, this subtle independence continues to guide every decision under the disguise of spiritual maturity. The root of this illusion lies in man's desire to manage outcomes, to ensure life unfolds according to his plans, even in the name of serving God. When prayers are not answered quickly, the self tries to force results. When divine silence lingers, the self interprets it as abandonment rather than refinement. This is why God often leads His people into seasons of stillness and uncertainty, to strip away the illusion of control. In those moments, our strength fails, our wisdom proves insufficient, and our plans crumble before us. Only then do we begin to see how much of our faith was actually dependence on ourselves. God cannot fill a vessel that is already full. As long as a man is confident in his ability to manage his life, the Spirit's guidance will remain faint. The voice of God speaks most clearly to those who have stopped trying to lead him. Control is rooted in fear. Fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of the unknown. And fear cannot coexist with trust. When the self clings to control, it builds walls around the heart that keep divine peace from entering. But when those walls collapse, when control slips through trembling fingers, then the Spirit finally has room to breathe within us. The breaking of this illusion often comes through pain. God, in His mercy, allows our control to fail, not to humiliate us, but to deliver us. He lets our efforts exhaust themselves until we realize that our striving cannot produce spiritual fruit. The very situations we once tried to manipulate become the instruments of our freedom. In surrender, the believer discovers that control was never security, it was captivity. To release control is to admit our helplessness and acknowledge that only God can truly lead. When the illusion fades, peace takes its place. The soul no longer measures faith by outcomes, but by obedience. It no longer seeks to understand every detail, but to trust the one who does. True freedom begins not when we gain control, but when we finally relinquish it. And in that holy surrender, the voice of God that once felt distant becomes near, clear, and unmistakably real. The wilderness experience is one of the most misunderstood yet sacred seasons in a believer's journey. It is the place where God removes every external support and strips away every illusion of strength. The wilderness is not a punishment, but a divine classroom where the soul learns to depend on God alone. It is here that the breaking of the self truly begins, not through comfort or success, but through silence, struggle, and solitude. When all familiar voices fade and every source of encouragement disappears, the heart is confronted with its own emptiness. The wilderness reveals who we really are, without the applause, the distractions, or the blessings that once made faith feel easy. In the wilderness, the self is exposed. The desires that once seemed noble are tested, and motives that were hidden beneath religious passion are brought to light. God uses the wilderness to purify intention, to separate the desire to serve Him from the desire to be seen serving Him. It is in this place that the believer learns that faith is not a feeling but a choice. The voice of God often seems silent in the wilderness, but it is precisely in that silence that the soul learns to listen differently, not through emotion, but through trust. Every servant of God has passed through this barren land. Moses was broken in the desert before he could speak for God. Elijah was tested in isolation before he could call down fire from heaven. Even Jesus withdrew to the wilderness before his public ministry began. In this lonely place, the outer man, the self that seeks control and recognition, is crushed, and the inner man, the spirit that hears and obeys, is awakened. The wilderness is not meant to destroy us, but to separate us from the world's noise and our own will, so that we can discern the voice that speaks softly but with eternal power. Many resist the wilderness because it feels like abandonment. The silence of God can seem unbearable when we are accustomed to quick answers and constant affirmation. Yet it is this silence that becomes the sharpest instrument of transformation. When there is nothing left to rely on but God, the soul discovers the depth of His sufficiency. The wilderness removes every false dependency until only the voice of the Spirit remains. What once seemed like emptiness becomes fullness. What once felt like isolation becomes communion. The wilderness experience changes how a person hears God. Before it, the believer listens for comfort and direction. After it, the believer listens for obedience and intimacy. The self that once demanded explanations now rests in quiet trust. The heart that once needed to be in control now delights in surrender. The wilderness may break the outer man, but it strengthens the spirit, forging a deeper, unshakable faith. And when the believer finally emerges from that barren land, he carries not the echo of his own desires, but the unmistakable whisper of God's eternal voice within him. The crushing of pride is one of the most essential yet painful works God performs in the life of a believer. Pride is subtle. It hides beneath confidence, disguises itself as strength, and often masquerades as zeal for God. But in reality, it is the most stubborn barrier to divine intimacy. Pride resists surrender, argues with conviction, and insists on being right even in spiritual matters. It is the voice within that says, I know better, even when God's word calls for humility. Until pride is broken, the heart remains too hard to fully receive the voice of God. It is only in humility that revelation can truly take root and bear fruit. God cannot speak clearly to a proud heart because pride distorts perception. A proud person hears only what confirms their own thinking. They interpret God's will through the lens of their preferences and filter truth through self-protection. This is why God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. Pride blinds the soul, dulls spiritual sensitivity, and creates an invisible wall between man and the spirit. To break that wall, God allows circumstances that shatter our confidence in ourselves. He uses failure, rejection, or misunderstanding to humble the soul, not to destroy it, but to bring it to the place where it can finally hear. The breaking of pride often comes in the form of disappointment, when our plans fail despite our prayers, when we are overlooked despite our efforts, or when our strength proves insufficient despite our determination. Pride begins to crumble. These moments expose how much of our faith was rooted not in trust, but in personal control. God allows the ground beneath us to shake until we realize that our stability was never in Him, but in our own ability to manage life. The collapse of pride feels like loss, but it is actually liberation. Once the heart bows in humility, the voice of God that once seemed distant becomes clear and tender. True humility is not thinking less of oneself, but seeing oneself rightly, utterly dependent on God. When pride dies, the need to defend, prove, or exalt oneself dies with it. The soul becomes quiet, teachable, and open to correction. It no longer competes for recognition, but finds joy in hidden obedience. In that stillness, God's voice resonates with greater clarity. The Spirit can now lead without resistance, correct without argument, and comfort without misunderstanding. The humble heart hears because it no longer speaks over God. The crushing of pride is the beginning of spiritual maturity. Only the broken and contrite spirit can carry the weight of divine truth without distorting it. The proud heart seeks revelation to boast. The humble heart receives it to serve. God breaks pride not to shame us, but to free us from the prison of self that keeps us deaf to His whisper. When pride is finally crushed, the believer no longer strives to be used by God, but simply longs to be near Him. And in that nearness, the voice of God is no longer a mystery. It becomes the natural language of a surrendered heart. The surrender of personal will is the deepest and most challenging act of the Christian life. It is easy to speak of obedience, but surrender goes far beyond outward compliance. It touches the very core of who we are. The will is the seat of decision, the center of control, and the place where independence hides most securely. We may yield our actions, our words, even our possessions to God, yet still cling to our own will. The breaking of the will is therefore not about losing personality or becoming passive. It is about yielding authority to the one who alone is wise and good. It is about laying down the right to decide what is best for ourselves and trusting that God's will, even when painful or confusing, is perfect. In every believer's journey, there comes a moment when God confronts the self-will directly. It is not always in grand decisions, but often in the quiet places of daily obedience. The Spirit whispers, "Let go," and something within resists. We sense the tension between divine purpose and personal desire. The mind argues, the heart struggles, and the will refuses to bend. Yet God waits patiently, not forcing submission, but inviting surrender. He knows that only when the will is yielded can his voice be truly heard. The unsurrendered will acts as a wall that muffles his direction. It filters truth through the lens of preference, twisting divine instruction into something more comfortable. Surrendering the will requires trust, deep, sometimes trembling trust. God often asks for surrender without explanation, calling us to obey without knowing the outcome. This is where faith is refined. When Abraham was told to offer Isaac, the test was not only about love for his son, it was about the death of self-will. When Jesus prayed in Gethsemane, saying, "Not my will, but yours be done," he demonstrated the ultimate breaking of the human will before divine authority. It was in that surrender that redemption was born. Likewise, our spiritual breakthroughs come when we stop negotiating with God and simply yield. The surrender of will also exposes how deeply we depend on our own understanding. We want control because we fear uncertainty. We want answers because we doubt God's motives. True surrender, however, lets go of the need to understand and chooses to believe that God is trustworthy even when his path is unclear. This is not weakness. It is strength under submission. The surrendered believer no longer prays for God to bless their plans, but for God to make them part of his. Such a person moves from striving to resting, from demanding to listening, from fear to faith. When the will finally bows, peace enters. The inner conflict that once drained the soul gives way to quiet assurance. The surrendered will becomes the vessel through which the Spirit speaks clearly and guides gently. What once felt like loss turns into freedom, for in releasing control, the believer discovers that God's will was never meant to crush but to complete. The breaking of the will is not the end of self. It is the beginning of life in its truest form, where the human spirit and the Spirit of God move as one. The purification of motives is one of the most subtle and necessary works of the Spirit in a believer's life. At first, many follow God with enthusiasm, driven by zeal and gratitude for his grace. But hidden beneath sincere devotion often lie mixed motives, desires for recognition, success, comfort, or personal fulfillment. These motives are not always sinful in appearance, yet they can corrupt the purity of our service and cloud the clarity of our spiritual hearing. God, in his mercy, allows circumstances that test and expose what truly drives us. When prayers go unanswered, when recognition fades, when obedience brings suffering instead of reward, it is then that the true state of the heart is revealed. We begin to see whether we serve God for who he is or for what he gives. Purifying motives is not a single act, but a process of divine refinement. Just as gold is purified through fire, so the human heart is refined through trials. Each disappointment, delay, and unanswered question becomes a mirror reflecting the true reason for our devotion. Spirit gently exposes self-interest disguised as spirituality, our need to feel important, our desire for emotional comfort, our subtle pride in spiritual knowledge. These impurities cannot remain hidden forever, for God desires truth in the inward parts. He will not allow his voice to mix with selfish ambition or ego-driven desires. His silence at times is his way of cleansing us, removing every false motivation that competes with his glory. As this purification deepens, the believer learns to seek God not for blessing, but for intimacy. The relationship shifts from transactional to transformational. No longer do we say, "Lord, use me," with the hidden desire to be noticed or admired. Instead, we pray, "Lord, purify me," even if it means being forgotten or misunderstood. It is in this place of inward cleansing that we begin to understand that obedience without purity can become idolatry of the self. God does not merely want servants who perform tasks. He wants vessels through whom his nature flows unhindered. A heart purified from self-interest becomes sensitive to his whisper because nothing within distorts what he says. The purification of motives also brings humility. We realize how easily our spiritual zeal can turn into pride and how quickly our acts of service can become means of self-validation. True purity silences the inner need to prove our worth, for we rest in the knowledge that God's approval is enough. In this humility, God's voice grows clearer. He speaks not to inflate the ego, but to direct the spirit. His guidance becomes simple, gentle, and unmistakable because the noise of self-ambition has been quieted. When motives are purified, the believer no longer measures faithfulness by visible success, but by inward alignment with God's heart. Even in obscurity or failure, there is peace, because the desire has shifted from achieving for God to being one with Him. This is the essence of spiritual maturity: to act from purity, to love without agenda, and to obey without expectation. Only then does the voice of God flow through the soul like clear water, untainted by the sediments of pride or self-seeking desire. The surrender of control is the final and perhaps most difficult stage in the breaking of the self. It is the moment when the believer learns that true spirituality is not about mastering divine principles, but about yielding completely to the will of God. From the beginning, human nature clings to control, the need to understand, to plan, to decide, to ensure outcomes. Even in faith, this desire subtly persists. We want to follow God, but we also want to know how, when, and why. We surrender in words, yet our hearts still wrestle to retain authority over the direction of our lives. The breaking of the self shatters this illusion of control and teaches that spiritual maturity is not the mastery of strength, but the acceptance of weakness under divine sovereignty. In the process of surrender, God often dismantles everything that once made us feel secure. He allows doors to close, plans to fail, and relationships to shift until we realize that nothing in our hands is truly stable. These moments of loss are not acts of cruelty, but of compassion. For as long as the soul believes it can manage life on its own terms, it will never fully depend on God. Control is an idol more subtle than pride. It disguises itself as wisdom, stewardship, or even spiritual discipline, but its core is self-reliance. Only when this idol is torn down can the Spirit of God freely govern the inner life. Surrender is not passive resignation, it is active trust. It is the deliberate act of laying down our rights, opinions, and timing and saying, "Your will be done," even when I don't understand. It is not a momentary prayer, but a lifelong posture of submission. The believer who is truly surrendered no longer measures God's goodness by comfort or visible blessing, but by the depth of His presence. When control is surrendered, anxiety begins to dissolve because the soul no longer bears the burden of directing its own path. Peace takes root where striving once lived, and the will of God once feared becomes the greatest source of rest. Through this surrender, the voice of God becomes more recognizable. It is no longer drowned out by the noise of personal agendas or the fear of losing control. The self, once restless and demanding, grows quiet and teachable. In that stillness, the Spirit's whispers become clear and steady, guiding without force, leading without struggle. Many believers mistake silence for absence, but those who have surrendered know it as the sacred space where God works unseen. It is here that He molds the soul into a vessel of obedience, able to act not from impulse or fear, but from divine prompting. When control is surrendered, the believer is no longer the architect of their destiny, but the instrument of God's purpose. Every decision, every delay, every detour becomes an opportunity to trust. The surrendered life is not weak. It is unshakable because it rests in the strength of the one who cannot fail. And though surrender may feel like death to the self, it is the only path to true spiritual freedom, where the soul no longer strives to hear the voice of God. It simply abides in it,